A veteran father and his little girl were wandering under the cold night sky, their German shepherd trotting faithfully by their side. The man had survived battlefields, but could he survive the quiet war of poverty and despair? Why would a child choose a life of hardship with her father instead of comfort with her mother? And what secret locked inside an old wooden chest could change everything for them? This is the story of Jack, Lily, and Duke, a journey of loss, love, and the kind of hope that refuses to die. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. The morning sky was heavy with gray clouds, a cold drizzle falling across the courthouse steps. The damp air clung to everything, carrying the bitter smell of wet asphalt and old stone. It was the kind of day when even victories felt muted and defeats cut deeper. Jack Miller sat on the worn wooden bench inside the courthouse hallway, his broad shoulders hunched forward, hands clasped tightly as though he were gripping a rifle again. He was 45, a war veteran whose frame still carried the strength of years in uniform, but his face bore the weight of battles beyond the battlefield. A faint scar traced along his jawline, a reminder of shrapnel in Afghanistan. His brown hair was threaded with gray at the temples, cut short as if military discipline still whispered in his ear. A trim beard shadowed his tired face, his hazel eyes dulled by fatigue, but still sharp with a soldier's alertness. Jack carried himself with quiet endurance, yet his silence spoke volumes about the storms inside him. Beside him sat his daughter, Lily Miller, a 12-year-old girl with chestnut hair that fell just below her shoulders in loose strands. Her big hazel eyes, so much like her father's, carried a light that hardship had not yet stolen. She wore a simple yellow sweater, slightly frayed at the cuffs, and clutched her school backpack on her lap, as though it were armor. She was small for her age, but there was a firmness in the way she sat, her lips pressed together in a line of resolve that looked strangely mature for a child. Lily had learned too quickly that childhood could vanish in an instant. Duke lay stretched out at their feet, a German shepherd nearly 5 years old. His coat was a handsome mix of sable and black, his ears alert even in rest. Duke's amber eyes scanned every passerby in the courthouse with protective vigilance. He had been Jack's partner since the war, a trained K-9 who had once searched rubble and guarded patrol lines. Now, stripped of medals and orders, Duke remained what he always had been, a guardian, loyal, and unyielding. He shifted occasionally, pressing closer to Lily's legs, sensing the tension that neither she nor her father voiced aloud. Across the hall, Margaret, Lily's mother, stood near the tall glass doors, her arm looped through that of her new partner, Robert Ashford. Margaret was a striking woman in her late 30s, tall and slim, with auburn hair cut in sleek layers and skin that bore the pampered glow of someone who had traded hardship for ease. She wore a tailored black coat and leather boots polished enough to reflect the courthouse lights. Her expression was calm, though a flicker of impatience betrayed her beneath the painted confidence. Margaret had once been the center of Jack's world, but comfort had seduced her away, and Robert, with his wealth and connections, was her new anchor. Robert himself was a man in his early 50s, tall and broad, his expensive suit hugging a body softened by indulgence rather than labor. He had a commanding presence, his square jaw clean-shaven, dark hair flecked with silver at the temples. Robert's voice, when he spoke to Margaret, carried a tone of certainty, as though life would always bend to his will. He regarded Jack and Lily with a detached curiosity, like one might study an artifact from a life he would never know. The air thickened when the clerk's voice called them into the courtroom. Inside, the chamber smelled faintly of varnished wood and paper, an austere place where families splintered and fates were inked on documents. Judge Helen Crawford presided over the case. She was in her late 50s, a woman with salt and pepper hair tied neatly into a bun. Her face was angular, her gray eyes sharp behind thin-rimmed glasses. Years on the bench had carved a stern expression into her features. But those who knew her understood she carried compassion beneath her rigid exterior. She believed in justice, but also in the quiet power of choice. Jack sat with Lily at his side, his large hands resting motionless on the table, knuckles white. Margaret and Robert sat opposite, Margaret's lips curved in a practiced smile that rarely touched her eyes. Duke lay at Jack's feet, head resting on his paws, but his ears flicked at every sound. The judge's voice carried through the room. This court has heard both parties regarding custody of Lily Miller. The law provides that, in situations such as this, the child's wishes are to be taken into account. Lily, do you understand what that means? All eyes turned to her. Lily's heart hammered in her chest, her small hands tightening around the straps of her backpack. For weeks, she had overheard the whispered arguments, seen the pitying looks from neighbors, and felt the weight of choosing between comfort and love. Margaret had promised her a bigger bedroom, private schools, vacations, even a pony. Jack had promised her nothing, except that he would never leave, that he would love her fiercely even when he had nothing else to give. She looked at her mother, beautiful, composed, radiant in a way that made Lily feel like a stranger to her. Robert sat beside Margaret, his hand on her shoulder, his eyes expectant. Then Lily turned her gaze to her father. Jack looked worn, his blazer frayed at the elbows, his shoes dulled, but his hazel eyes held something Margaret's never did: truth. There was no manipulation in them, no promise he couldn't keep, just love, raw and steady, and the weight of a man who had fought wars and still feared losing the one thing that mattered most. The silence stretched until the judge spoke again. Lily, you may tell us where you would prefer to live. Lily swallowed, her throat dry. She glanced at Duke, whose ears perked up as though he too were waiting for her choice. The dog had lain beside her on nights when nightmares clawed at her, had nudged her awake when she cried silently into her pillow. Duke was more than a dog. He was family. Her voice came out small at first, but it grew steadier with each word. I want to live with my dad, and Duke. The words rippled through the courtroom like a quiet storm. Margaret's eyes widened, her painted composure cracking for the first time. Robert shifted in his seat, frowning. Jack's breath caught in his chest, his fingers trembling as though a weight had been lifted but left him shaken. He blinked, his eyes moist, though he quickly looked down to hide it. Judge Crawford nodded solemnly. So noted. Her gaze softened just slightly as she looked at Jack. Mr. Miller, the court grants you primary custody. Jack exhaled, shoulders sagging, the fight in him replaced with fragile relief. He reached under the table, his hand resting on Lily's smaller one. She squeezed back, smiling with a quiet bravery that made his heart ache. Margaret stood abruptly, her coat swishing around her legs. Lily, think about what you're giving up. You'll regret this, she hissed, but the words only made the girl's grip on her father's hand tighten. Jack raised his head then, his voice low but firm. She's made her choice. As the gavel struck, the chapter of their old life closed. Jack, Lily, and Duke walked out of the courthouse together. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the sky still gray, but holding a faint promise of light. Jack knew the path ahead would be hard. Poverty, struggle, the uncertainty of rebuilding from nothing. But for the first time in years, he felt he wasn't walking it alone. Lily had chosen him, and Duke, ever faithful, trotted beside them, as though he too understood that this was the beginning of something new. The drizzle had stopped by late afternoon, but the air still held the damp chill of the courthouse as Jack drove his battered pickup out of town. The bench seat squeaked with every bump in the road, the windshield wipers clinging stubbornly to the glass though the rain was gone. Lily sat close beside him, her yellow sweater tugged tight around her shoulders. She was quiet, staring out the window at the passing strip malls, her lips pressed together. Duke sprawled in the truck bed behind them, head raised, ears twitching at every sound, his body alert even in stillness. Jack had never imagined this would be their life, driving away from a courtroom with primary custody of his daughter and nowhere permanent to go. His old apartment lease had expired months ago when Margaret moved out, and with her gone, so had the money. He had been sleeping in the truck for weeks, waiting for the court's decision, hoping that somehow Lily wouldn't see how low he had sunk. Now she was with him, and hiding the truth would no longer be possible. They stopped at a convenience store just outside the courthouse district. Jack bought 2 ham sandwiches wrapped in plastic and a small carton of chocolate milk for Lily. He counted his bills twice before handing them to the cashier, a tired woman in her 50s with frizzy blonde hair and red lipstick that had bled into the lines around her mouth. She glanced at the veteran's discount card clipped to his keychain, her face softening. "Thank you for your service," she murmured, her voice weary but genuine. Jack gave her a small nod, unable to meet her eyes. When they pulled into the dimly lit parking lot behind a 24-hour laundromat, Lily finally asked, "Where are we staying tonight, Dad?" Her voice was steady, but the question carried a quiet fear. Jack tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "Here, for now," he admitted. "The truck's not much, but it's ours." Lily nodded slowly. She did not cry, though her shoulders slumped. "As long as Duke's here, I'll be okay." That night, they folded the front seats back as far as they would go. Lily curled against her backpack for a pillow. Jack draped his military jacket over her, tucking it under her chin like a blanket. Duke pressed against the door, positioning himself between them and the world outside, his breath heavy and steady like a sentinel's heartbeat. But for Jack, sleep was never simple. Hours after Lily had drifted off, his eyes remained open, staring at the cracked roof of the truck. Every creak, every gust of wind brought back echoes. Artillery in the distance, men shouting, the metallic scream of mortar fire. His body tensed, waiting for danger. When a car door slammed somewhere across the lot, Jack's heart jolted into his throat. Duke's ears flicked up, a low growl rumbling from his chest. But when Jack stroked the dog's neck, Duke settled, his eyes still watchful. Jack closed his eyes, trying to steady his, breathing. He remembered Afghanistan, the mission that had marked him forever. His unit had been ambushed near Kandahar. He had pulled 2 men from the rubble of a collapsed building, but a third, his closest friend, Corporal Ryan Mercer, had been buried beyond reach. Jack still heard his voice, muffled and fading. He had carried that failure home, stitched into his soul, and though people thanked him for his service, none of them knew the weight he bore when thunder cracked in the night. Lily stirred beside him. Even half asleep, she reached for his arm. "Dad?" she whispered. "I'm here," he said, his voice rough. He wrapped his hand over hers, squeezing gently until she relaxed. Duke exhaled loudly, settling his head on his paws again. By morning, the truck was fogged with condensation, their breath clouding the glass. Lily sat up, rubbing her eyes. She was pale, her hair tangled, but she forced a smile. "Can we get breakfast?" Jack had a few dollars left. They walked into the laundromat cafe, a dingy corner with mismatched tables. The owner, a stout man named Mr. Ramirez, greeted them. He was in his 60s with graying hair combed neatly to one side, and a bushy mustache that gave him a perpetually serious expression. His forearms were thick, his shirt rolled at the sleeves, and though his face was stern, his eyes were kind. "You're new here," Ramirez said, eyeing Jack's military jacket. "Coffee's on the house for veterans." Jack hesitated, then nodded his thanks. Lily ordered a small plate of scrambled eggs, which Ramirez cooked himself, moving slowly but deliberately behind the counter. He had once owned a larger diner before his wife's illness drained their savings. Now this laundromat cafe was all he had left. Perhaps that was why he treated strangers with quiet dignity. He knew what it meant to fall. Jack and Lily ate quickly, Duke lying obediently under the table, his nose twitching at the smell of food. Ramirez lingered nearby, wiping down a counter. "If you ever need laundry, bring it here," he said. "For you, we'll work something out." The kindness cut deeper than cruelty ever could. Jack nodded again, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. That afternoon, Jack found a day's work unloading pallets at a hardware store. The manager, a wiry man named Craig Dalton, was in his 40s, with thinning hair and a sharp nose. His arms were lean but roped with muscle from years of manual labor. Dalton barked instructions quickly, never raising his voice in cruelty, but never wasting time either. He had grown up poor, left school early, and now lived by the rule that every man earned his worth with sweat. He gave Jack a glance up and down. "You've got the build. Don't slow down, and you'll get paid cash at the end of the shift." Jack worked until his back screamed, stacking lumber until his arms trembled. By the time he returned to the truck, his shirt clung to him, with sweat and sawdust. Lily had waited in the library nearby, reading from the old books she loved. Duke had stayed with her, drawing smiles from passers-by who were charmed by his calm loyalty. That night, they parked again in the laundromat lot. Lily curled up in the truck bed this time, under a blanket Jack had found in the supply closet at work. Jack leaned against the tailgate, staring at the stars through the haze of the city lights. Duke lay pressed against his leg, his warmth grounding him against the creeping edges of memory. When thunder rolled faintly in the distance, Jack froze, his body stiffening. Duke raised his head, ears sharp, watching his master's face. Lily stirred awake and whispered, "It's just the sky, Dad. It can't hurt us." Her voice was soft but steady, carrying more strength than her years. Jack swallowed hard, brushing his hand over her hair. "You're right, kiddo," he said. But deep inside, he wasn't sure if he believed it. They would endure this night, and the next, and however many came after. As long as they had each other, and Duke standing guard, Jack knew they still had a chance. The third week of living out of the truck left Jack's back stiff and Lily's patience stretched thin. They had survived on sandwiches, laundromat coffee, and the goodwill of strangers like Ramirez, but Jack knew it could not last. Children needed roots, not parking lots. Each night he watched his daughter curl beneath his worn jacket, and the decision pressed harder. They needed a place, no matter how poor. Late one morning, after another exhausting shift unloading lumber, Jack noticed a handwritten flyer pinned to the bulletin board outside the hardware store. The paper was damp from rain, the ink smudged, but the words were clear. Property for sale, old warehouse, cheap, serious buyers only. Jack tore it down, folding it carefully into his pocket. That afternoon, he drove Lily and Duke to the edge of town. The road narrowed, leading past weed-choked lots and sagging fences. The warehouse stood alone at the end of the lane, its corrugated metal walls rust-stained and dented, roof panels sagging like broken wings. Windows were boarded, graffiti scrawled across one side, but a faint hum from a utility box suggested power lines still clung to life. Jack parked, stepped out, and took a long breath of the damp air. His boots crunched on gravel as he walked the perimeter. The building was larger than he expected, 2 stories if you counted the loft space above. The front doors were heavy wood, cracked but intact. A warped sign read, "Gray and Sons Feed Supply." The paint faded to ghosts. A man was waiting by the entrance. He was in his early 60s, tall but slightly stooped, his frame wiry beneath a corduroy jacket. His name was Mr. Howard, the property agent. His thinning gray hair was combed back neatly, his face long and sun-weathered with deep creases around his mouth. He had the look of someone who had spent too many years outdoors, yet his handshake was firm, businesslike. "You Jack Miller?" he asked, glancing at the flyer in Jack's hand. "Yes," Jack replied. "This the place?" Howard nodded. "Belonged to the Gray family. Been sitting empty 10 years. Town wanted it condemned, but it's still standing. Cheap because no one wants to bother with it. I can give you power and water hooked up, barely. But don't expect miracles." Lily stepped closer, holding Duke's collar as the shepherd sniffed the weeds. Her eyes widened as she looked at the warehouse. "It's huge," she whispered. "Could we live here?" Jack's throat tightened. The roof sagged, walls gaped, but in his daughter's eyes, it was more than a ruin. It was potential. He turned back to Howard. "How much?" Howard named a figure low enough to make Jack flinch, not from the cost, but from how little it still was compared to what little he owned. Jack pulled out his worn wallet, counted the crumpled bills and the last of his savings. It was enough, barely. Howard raised a brow. "You're serious?" Jack nodded. "It's not pretty, but it's ours." His voice was half joke, half defiance, though his chest ached with the risk. Howard scribbled a receipt, pressing the paper into Jack's hand. "Keys are yours. Don't say I didn't warn you." Inside, the air smelled of mildew and dust. The floor was concrete, cracked and littered with broken pallets and rusted nails. Shafts of light pierced holes in the roof, illuminating swirls of dust like ghostly stars. Lily coughed, covering her mouth, but her eyes shone with excitement. "We can make it a home," she said firmly. Duke patted ahead, his claws clicking on the concrete, tail wagging once as if giving approval. He nosed through a pile of old feed bags, scattering mice that scurried into the shadows. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Jack brought in their few belongings: a blanket, Lily's backpack, and a battered metal trunk where he kept his discharge papers and medals. They spread their things on the cleanest patch of floor. Jack set a small camping stove in the corner and boiled water for instant soup. It wasn't much, but Lily slurped happily, leaning against his shoulder. The next day, a neighbor appeared. George Whitaker was a retired carpenter who lived in a small house across the gravel road. He was in his late 60s, tall and broad-shouldered, his belly softened by age, but his arms still thick with muscle. His skin was ruddy, his hair white and unruly beneath a battered cap. He had a full beard, trimmed roughly, and eyes the pale blue of winter skies. George had lived through 2 divorces and the death of a son in Iraq. Grief had hardened him, but also left him compassionate to men who carried the same burdens. He leaned on the fence post, watching Jack hammer loose boards. "You really moving into that wreck?" he called, his voice gravelly but not unkind. Jack wiped sweat from his brow. "Got no choice. My girl needs a roof." George snorted but walked over, glancing at Lily sweeping the floor with a broken broom handle. "You'll need more than a roof, son. That place'll eat you alive if you don't patch it right." Jack straightened, meeting his gaze. "You know woodwork?" George cracked a smile, revealing crooked teeth. 40 years a carpenter. Don't let the belly fool you." He eyed Duke, who stood alert but quiet. "Good dog. Loyal eyes. I had one like him once." His voice dipped, shadowed by memory. By afternoon, George had fetched a toolbox and joined them. He showed Lily how to pull nails safely, his large hands surprisingly gentle. Jack worked beside him, nailing sheets of plywood over broken windows. For the first time in weeks, Jack felt less alone. That night, under the leaking roof, Jack looked at his daughter curled up in her blanket, Duke stretched beside her, George's hammer still echoing faintly in his ears. The warehouse was broken, but it was theirs. "Not beautiful," Jack whispered to himself, "but it's home." The first days inside the warehouse blurred into one long rhythm of sweat, dust, and exhaustion. Each morning, sunlight streamed through the gaps in the roof, turning floating dust into bright motes, and each evening, the same light faded to gloom as the wind whistled through broken seams. Jack worked until his arms ached and his back screamed, but he pressed on because the sight of Lily sweeping and Duke dragging boards filled him with something close to pride. Jack hammered planks over shattered windows, his calloused hands blistering under the strain. Sweat dripped down his brow, stinging his eyes, and he paused only when Duke barked once, a sharp warning sound. The dog had caught the scent of a raccoon sneaking through the open back door. Muscular and lean, Duke stood stiff, ears high, amber eyes locked on the intruder until it scurried away. Jack knelt to pat his flank. "Good boy." Always watching Lily was no less determined. Though only 12, she carried trash in armfuls. Her small hands scraped raw from rusted nails and splinters. Her chestnut hair stuck to her cheeks with sweat, her sweater smudged with grime. Yet, when Jack told her to rest, she straightened her back and shook her head stubbornly. "I want to help, Dad." "This is ours, too." She smiled faintly at Duke, who wagged his tail as if to second her resolve. George Whitaker, their grizzled neighbor, had become an almost daily presence. His heavy boots thudded across the gravel as he arrived with a tool belt slung low on his wide waist and a battered cooler in hand. His wiry white beard bristled whenever he grinned, which was rare but genuine. He had the air of a man who had buried more than one sorrow, but still knew how to share kindness in small doses. George would hand Lily a sandwich and mutter, "Eat before your old man drives you into the ground." His gruff humor was his way of softening the weight of labor. One late afternoon, as Jack struggled to lift a beam into place, George called over, "Hold up, soldier. You'll bust your spine before the roof's half done." Jack hesitated, his pride prickling, but George's pale blue eyes narrowed with the authority of years. Together, with Duke tugging at a rope Jack had knotted to the beam, they hoisted it up. Sweat poured down Jack's temples, and his knuckles throbbed, but when the beam slid into place, a rare smile cracked George's beard. "Not bad," he muttered. That evening, George sat on an overturned crate, eating one of his sandwiches while Duke gnawed on a leftover bone. Jack wiped his hands and sat across from him. "Why are you helping us?" he asked quietly. George took a long sip from a thermos before answering. "My boy, Nathan, he served in Iraq, came home with ghosts, same as you. But he didn't have someone to remind him why to fight on. Lost him 5 years back. When I see you and the girl, I see a second chance to do right by someone. Don't waste it." His voice was low, rough as gravel but honest. Jack's chest tightened. He reached for Lily, who had dozed against Duke's warm flank, and whispered, "I won't." Not every neighbor was kind. On the third evening, a woman from the far end of the lane came by, arms crossed over her chest. Her name was Mrs. Carter, a thin woman in her early 50s with tightly curled gray hair and sharp brown eyes. She wore a faded floral dress, her lips pressed in disapproval. "You can't just turn that dump into a home," she snapped. "It's dangerous. Vermin, mold, the roof could kill you in your sleep. You'll drive property values down." Jack stood straighter, jaw tightening, but before he could speak, George stepped forward, towering over the woman. "He's fixing it, Martha. Better a man working honest to make a place for his kid than leaving it to rot. You should mind your own porch." His voice carried finality, and Mrs. Carter muttered under her breath before retreating. After she left, Jack muttered, "Didn't mean to stir up trouble." George shook his head. "Trouble finds you whether you mean it or not. What matters is, you keep hammering anyway." As the week stretched on, the warehouse began to shift. The piles of trash dwindled, broken glass swept away. Corners cleared for Lily's small cot and Jack's makeshift bedroll. The sound of hammering, sawing, and Duke's occasional bark became the rhythm of their days. At night, Jack collapsed onto his blanket, his body screaming with fatigue, but when he looked up at the patched roof holding back the stars, he felt something he hadn't in months: progress. One night, as thunder rolled in the distance, Jack jerked awake, sweat slick on his skin, his body reliving the mortar fire of Kandahar. Duke pressed against him, a low whine in his throat, grounding him in the present. Lily stirred, rubbing her eyes. "Dad?" she whispered. Jack swallowed hard, brushing her hair gently. "It's just a storm. Go back to sleep." But inside, he knew he was fighting storms no roof could keep out. The days remained punishing, yet Jack found a strange comfort in the rhythm. Work by day, battle ghosts by night, but never alone. Lily's scraped hands, Duke's steady presence, George's blunt humor, all became the silent comrades he hadn't realized he needed. The morning after another long night of patching leaks, Jack found a thin envelope wedged into the warehouse's crooked doorframe. The paper was stamped with the logo of Green Valley Storage, the facility where years earlier Margaret had stored their household items when the marriage first cracked apart. Jack's brows furrowed as he slid it open with a calloused thumb. His jaw tightened while reading, "Notice of liquidation." If he didn't reclaim their storage unit by Friday evening, the contents would be sold to the highest bidder. Lily looked up from her schoolbook, her hair tied into a crooked ponytail. "What is it, Dad?" Jack exhaled, folding the letter. "They're selling off the old storage unit. That's where I put your grandmother's things after she passed. If we don't get it now, it's gone forever." The words lit a spark in Lily's eyes. She had only fragments of memory about her grandmother Rosalie, a warm laugh, the smell of bread on Sunday mornings, but the idea of losing those pieces hurt. She grabbed Jack's sleeve. "We have to get it back." 2 days later, they drove across town. The Green Valley storage facility was a row of faded blue doors behind a chain-link fence, guarded by a woman at the front desk. Her name tag read Sarah Hanley. Sarah was in her mid-40s, tall and slender, her long auburn hair pulled into a messy bun. She had pale freckled skin and tired green eyes that hinted at sleepless nights. She spoke in clipped tones, efficient but not unkind, the type of woman who had endured too many complaints in too many jobs. "You're here for Unit 217?" she asked, checking her clipboard. "Auction starts in 15 minutes. If you've got the fee, you can reclaim it. Otherwise, it's gone." Jack pulled out the last of his cash, the bills creased and worn. Sarah's eyes flickered to Lily, standing close beside him, then to Duke, who waited patiently at the door, his fur gleaming in the noon sun. Something softened in her gaze. She stamped the form and handed Jack the keys. "You're just in time. Make it quick." Unit 217's door screeched as it rolled upward. The air inside smelled of dust and fabric long sealed away. Boxes stacked to the ceiling leaned precariously. A lamp with a broken shade poked out, and old clothes spilled from a cracked suitcase. But in the center sat a wooden trunk, scarred with age, brass hinges dulled but still intact. Lily's breath caught. "That's hers." Jack knelt, brushing his hand over the lid. The wood was worn smooth at the edges, as though many hands had lifted it through generations. He lifted it open, hinges groaning. Inside lay a faded photograph of Rosalie smiling in her garden, her arms flower-dusted. Beside it was her old apron, white once, but now stained with patches of flour, grease, and faint streaks of jam. And nestled under the fabric was a thick notebook, its leather cover cracked, its pages yellowed. Lily reached in with trembling fingers. Her recipe book. Jack turned a page carefully. Inked handwriting curled across the paper, notes scribbled in the margins. The smell of old paper mingled with faint traces of cinnamon and yeast, as though the trunk itself carried Rosalie's kitchen. Jack's chest tightened. He remembered mornings as a boy, when Rosalie's bread filled the house with warmth, when her voice told him that food was love, written in flour and fire. As they loaded the trunk into the truck bed, a man approached, frowning. He was stocky, in his late 30s, with slicked-back hair and a stubbled jaw. His name was Randy Pike, one of the bidders waiting for the auction. Randy had the look of someone always on the hustle, eyes darting, voice sharp. "That trunk was mine for the taking," he said, stepping close. "Could have fetched a good price at the flea market." "You're cutting it close." Miller Jack squared his shoulders, his scar visible under the sunlight. His voice was calm, but steel-lined. "It wasn't yours to begin with." Duke growled softly, ears up, teeth flashing just enough to make Randy step back with a muttered curse. Sarah appeared from the office door, her sharp voice carrying. "Pike, auction's over. Let them be." Randy spat on the ground but retreated, his boots thudding across the lot. Sarah shook her head. "Ignore him. He preys on leftovers." She glanced again at Lily. "You're lucky you made it today." Driving back, Lily kept the recipe book on her lap, her fingers tracing the handwriting. "Dad, we can use this. We can bake like Grandma did, maybe even sell them." Jack smiled faintly, though lines of worry still etched his brow. "One step at a time, kiddo. First, we make this warehouse livable. Then, maybe we bring back the smell of her kitchen." That evening, they placed the trunk in a corner of the warehouse, beside Lily's cot. Jack hung Rosalie's faded apron on a nail hammered into the wall. The recipe book rested on a crate they used as a table. Duke curled beside it, as if guarding the new treasure. For the first time, the warehouse smelled less of mildew and dust, and more of memory, of warmth, of family, of possibility. Jack sat back, exhausted but strangely at peace. Lily leafed through the book, Duke's head resting on her lap. Hope, he realized, did not always come roaring. Sometimes it came in the form of a trunk, an apron, and the yellowed pages of a grandmother's handwriting. The chill of early morning clung to the warehouse, but inside it smelled of something different: flour, sugar, and the faint warmth of rising dough. Jack had rigged an old camping oven near the corner, wires patched into the unreliable electric box, and Lily hovered eagerly beside him, the recipe book open on the crate they used as a table. Rosalie's handwriting guided them, though neither father nor daughter had baked more than biscuits from a can. Jack's broad hands moved cautiously, mixing flour with water, salt, and yeast. His knuckles were scarred from years of war and work, but they trembled now as he tried to measure teaspoons instead of weighty decisions. Lily, wearing her grandmother's apron, far too large for her small frame, brushed flour across her cheeks without noticing. She read aloud, "Fold the dough, let it breathe." Grandma wrote, "It's like caring for a child. Patience makes it grow." She glanced at her father, her smile nervous but hopeful. "I think we're doing okay." Duke lay close, nose twitching at the unfamiliar smells, tail thumping once against the floor whenever Lily's laugh broke through. He was more used to guarding doors than kitchens, but this morning he looked like he understood the importance of what they were attempting. By late afternoon, their first batch emerged, misshapen rolls, some too brown, some pale, but the aroma filled the warehouse with warmth that drove out mildew and dust. Lily clapped her hands, her hazel eyes shining. "It smells like home." Jack broke one open, steam curling into the air. He tasted cautiously. It wasn't perfect, but it wasn't failure either. He nodded, swallowing past the lump in his throat. "It'll do." The next morning, they set up a makeshift stand outside the warehouse. Jack had hammered together a table from discarded planks, and Lily decorated it with chalk she borrowed from school. On the rough slate board, she scrawled in looping letters, "Fresh bread, $1." Their tray held 24 rolls, uneven but golden, resting on wax paper. George was the first to arrive. The old carpenter ambled over in his worn cap, his boots crunching on gravel. He sniffed the air, his white beard twitching with amusement. "Well, I'll be damned. Smells like a bakery in the middle of nowhere." He dug into his pocket, producing a crumpled dollar. "One for me and one for the dog." Lily giggled as she handed him 2 rolls, and George tore a piece off for Duke, who accepted it with solemn dignity. "Not bad," George muttered between bites, his pale eyes twinkling. "A bit heavy, but it tastes like someone cared." He gave Lily a wink before strolling back across the road. The second customer came by accident. A woman in her early 30s, jogging with earbuds in, slowed when she saw the stand. Her name was Amanda Price, a nurse at the county clinic. Tall and athletic, with brown hair pulled into a ponytail, her skin glistened with sweat from her run. She paused, pulling out one earbud. "You're selling bread out here?" Jack straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. "First try, can't promise much." Amanda smiled, handing over $1. She bit into a roll, her expression shifting to surprise. "It's good. Reminds me of my grandmother's kitchen." She gave Lily an encouraging nod before jogging off again, leaving behind the faint smell of citrus soap. By midday, a third customer appeared, an older man named Mr. Vernon. He was in his 70s, with a stooped frame, wispy white hair, and thick glasses sliding down his nose. He lived 3 blocks away and walked with a cane. He stopped, leaned heavily, and studied the sign. "Bread for $1, eh?" His voice was cracked with age but kind. He bought 1 roll, chewed slowly, then returned 10 minutes later. "Got any more?" "Tastes like the kind my wife used to make his eyes misted." And he bought 3 more, tucking them carefully into his coat. Lily's grin stretched wide. "He came back, Dad." Jack allowed himself a rare smile. "That means we're onto something." But not everyone was welcoming. In the late afternoon, a black SUV pulled up. A man in a crisp gray suit stepped out, polished shoes gleaming against the dirt road. He was in his early 40s, broad-shouldered with slick black hair and a neatly trimmed beard. His name was Martin Ellis, owner of Ellis Bakery, the largest shop in town. Martin's sharp blue eyes scanned the makeshift stand, and his lips curled with disdain. "You can't just set up here and sell food without permits," he said coldly. His voice carried authority, the kind of tone used to intimidate rather than question. "Health inspectors will shut you down." Jack bristled, his shoulders stiffening. "We're just making a start." Martin's gaze shifted to Lily, then to Duke, who growled low in his throat. He smirked. "Cute. But this town doesn't need competition from amateurs." He slid back into his SUV, tires crunching as he pulled away. Lily's smile faltered, but Jack placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "Let him talk. We'll keep baking." That evening, the tray was empty. They hadn't made much, barely $10, but Lily tucked the bills into a jar with pride. "This is the start of our bakery," she whispered to Duke, who wagged his tail as if agreeing. As the sun set, Jack sat on the warehouse steps, his body aching but his heart lighter. He watched Lily sketch new ideas for their chalkboard sign, while Duke rested beside her, ever watchful. The day had brought more than customers. It had brought proof. Even in a broken place, something warm and alive could grow. The sky grew restless that week, gray clouds stacking above the town, like an army gathering its ranks. Jack felt it in his bones before the first drops fell, the air heavy with the same tension he had once known in the desert before mortars struck. Lily tried to stay cheerful, chalking bright sunflowers on the bakery board outside, while Duke lay with his ears twitching toward the distant rumble. George had warned them, "Storm's coming. Tie down what you can." By nightfall, the wind howled against the warehouse, rattling the patched windows. Jack stood guard by the door, flashlight in hand, his jaw tight as rain hammered the roof. At first the patch panels held, but then came the metallic shriek. One sheet of tin peeled away, then another, ripped into the darkness like shrapnel. Water poured through the gaps. dousing the oven they had cobbled together. Sparks hissed and died, the smell of wet ash rising. Lily cried out, clutching her grandmother's recipe book to her chest. "Dad, the oven!" Tears streamed down her flour-dusted cheeks. Jack grabbed her shoulders, voice steady, though his own chest ached. "Books can dry, sweetheart." "You can't. Stay back," Duke barked sharply, his deep voice cutting through the storm, pacing by the door as if calling for help. The warehouse shook, and for a moment, Jack thought the roof might collapse. He braced himself against the door until dawn finally broke, gray and weary. The rain slowed, leaving the place gutted. The oven was ruined, the roof half gone. Jack stared at the wreckage in silence, his hands shaking not from cold, but from the crushing weight of defeat. Lily sobbed quietly into Duke's fur, the shepherd sitting still as a stone, his amber eyes fixed on his master as if waiting for orders. Mid-morning brought another blow. A sleek car rolled up, and Martin Ellis stepped out. The bakery owner in his polished shoes and neat beard, his umbrella barely bent under the wind, his eyes sharp and self-satisfied. "Told you this was no place for amateurs," he sneered. "Selling food without permits, in unsafe conditions? You'll be hearing from the health board." He smirked as though the storm itself had answered his wishes. Jack wanted to reply, but his throat locked. He had faced bullets without flinching, but the shame of his daughter watching this man gloat pierced deeper than steel. It was George who acted. The old carpenter arrived, raincoat hanging loose on his broad frame, his beard soaked. He took in the scene, the broken roof, the ruined oven, Lily's tear-streaked face, and pulled out his phone. "Stand together," he muttered, then snapped photo after photo. He posted them with quick, blunt words. War vet and little girl lost everything in last night's storm. They just wanted to sell bread. We can do better. By afternoon, neighbors trickled in. Mrs. Carter, who had once complained, appeared with a bundle of old blankets. She said little, her lips pressed, thin, but she left them on the doorstep before retreating. Amanda Price, the nurse who had once jogged by, came with a pickup loaded with bottled water and canned goods. Her hair was damp from the rain, her eyes bright with determination. "You're not giving up," she said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to saving lives. Mr. Vernon, the elderly man with the cane, shuffled in with a bundle of tin sheets strapped awkwardly to a cart. His hands trembled as he offered them. "My son's shed. He'd want you to use them." His watery eyes glistened as Lily hugged him tightly. By evening, even strangers came. A young man in his 20s, thin with messy blonde hair and a stud in his ear, arrived with a battered oven in the back of his truck. His name was Kyle, a mechanic from the next town over. "Saw the post," he explained. "This old thing still works. Needs rewiring, but I'll help set it up." His hands were grease-stained, his grin boyish, but his sincerity undeniable. Sarah Hanley, the storage clerk, drove by near sunset. She stepped out, her auburn hair loose under the drizzle, holding a folder of forms. "I called in a favor," she said, her green eyes tired but warm. "Temporary vendor permit. It'll keep the inspectors off your back while you get sorted." She handed it to Jack, who stared at the paper as if it were gold. For the first time all day, he felt his chest loosen. He looked around, neighbors climbing ladders with George, hammering new panels into place. Lily kneeling with Amanda, sorting supplies. Duke pacing proudly, tail wagging as if he understood they were no longer alone. That night, as lanterns glowed in the patched warehouse, Jack sat on a crate, watching Lily laugh with Kyle as they tested the oven. His body was exhausted, his scars aching, but his spirit felt strangely light. The storm had stripped them bare, but out of that ruin had come something greater. He ran a hand over Duke's head, whispering, "We'll make it. Not because of me, but because of all of us." A year passed, and the broken warehouse at the edge of town had transformed into something unrecognizable. Where rust and mildew once clung to every corner, warm yellow lights now glowed against fresh siding. A carved wooden sign swung gently in the breeze above the door, painted by George himself, Duke's Bakery. Beneath the name was a simple sketch of a German shepherd's head, proud and watchful. Inside, the air was thick with the fragrance of cinnamon, honey, and butter. Customers crowded the counter, their voices low with the kind of comfort that food brings. The sunrise roll, a sweet pastry adapted from Rosalie's old recipe book, had become the talk of the town, soft layers brushed with honey, sprinkled with sunflower seeds, and glazed to a golden shine. People drove in from neighboring counties to buy them, often lining up before dawn. Jack stood behind the counter, apron tied around his solid frame. The hard edges of his face had softened slightly, though the scar across his jaw still reminded him daily of the soldier he had once been. His hazel eyes, once dulled by fatigue, now carried quiet confidence. He still bore the shadows of war and sleepless nights, but the bakery gave him something the battlefield never could: a purpose beyond survival. Customers greeted him warmly. "Morning, Jack," and he answered with a nod, his voice steady, no longer weighed down by shame. Lily moved among the tables, her yellow sweater replaced by a neat school uniform, her hair tied back with a ribbon. At 13, she had grown taller, her cheekbones sharper, but her smile brighter. Her classmates whispered with awe that her family ran the most beloved bakery in town. And for the first time, she no longer kept her head down at school. She carried trays of sunrise rolls with grace, laughing easily, her voice like sunlight cutting through the remnants of her father's darkness. Duke had his own place in the story. At 6 years old, the shepherd had grown broader, his sable and black coat thick and glossy. He spent his days lying on the porch, his ears perked, amber eyes following every customer with a calm intensity. Children loved to pat his head as they left, and parents smiled, knowing that this dog was both mascot and guardian. His presence was more than decoration. It was a reminder that loyalty had carried this family from ruin to hope. George Whitaker had become part of the furniture at Duke's bakery. Each morning, he occupied the same chair near the window, his burly frame squeezed into a wooden seat he had built himself. His white beard was longer now, his laugh easier. He often helped in the back, teaching Jack the finer points of carpentry when new shelves or counters were needed. "You keep the bread soft, I'll keep the walls standing," he liked to joke, his pale blue eyes twinkling. Amanda Price, the nurse who once stopped mid-jog, was now a regular. After her shifts at the clinic, she dropped by for coffee and a roll, often chatting with Lily about school. Amanda was tall and athletic, her brown hair usually tied into a messy bun, and her kindness had turned into friendship with both Jack and Lily. Some of the town had begun to speculate that Jack and Amanda were more than friends, but Jack, still healing, only smiled when teased. Even Sarah Hanley, the auburn-haired storage clerk who had once stamped papers for them, came by from time to time. Her green eyes seemed brighter now, less weighed down, and she often ordered extra pastries to bring back for her co-workers. She liked to remind Jack, "If I hadn't gotten that temporary permit, you'd still be hiding from inspectors." Jack would answer, "And if we hadn't had neighbors like you, this place wouldn't exist at all." Not everyone had softened. Martin Ellis, the polished bakery owner, still scowled when Duke's Bakery was mentioned. His business continued, but the glow of attention had shifted. His sharp blue eyes and neatly trimmed beard were often seen watching from across the farmer's market. But he said little now. The town had chosen its favorite, and no threats of permits could erase what had grown from Rosalie's recipes and Jack's sweat. On the bakery's 1-year anniversary, Lily insisted on hosting a small gathering. Lanterns hung from the rafters, filling the space with golden light. Customers crowded in, neighbors brought gifts of flowers and jam, and George stood up, clearing his throat. "A year ago, this was a broken warehouse," he said, his voice carrying. "Now it's a home, a business, and a beacon. We've all shared in its making, but it began with one soldier, one girl, and one damn good dog." Laughter rippled through the crowd, though Jack's eyes misted as he lowered his head in humility. That night, after the crowd left, Jack locked the doors and sat on the steps outside. Lily leaned against him, the recipe book open on her lap, Duke's head heavy against her knees. The moonlight spilled across the sign above, Duke's Bakery, and for the first time in years, Jack felt the weight of survival lift into something greater. This was no longer just about scraping by. It was about building a life worthy of his daughter's choice, of his dog's loyalty, and of his grandmother's legacy. Happiness did not roar. It came quietly, like the smell of bread rising in the oven, warm and steady, promising tomorrow. From the courthouse steps to the broken warehouse, from nights spent in an old truck to mornings scented with fresh bread, Jack, Lily, and Duke proved that even the most fragile beginnings can bloom into something lasting. Their story is not just about survival, it is about choosing love over comfort, loyalty over despair, and the quiet power of community rising to mend what storms once tore apart. The lesson is simple yet eternal. When people stand together, when faith is stronger than fear, miracles are no longer rare, they are inevitable. A father's resilience, a daughter's trust, and a dog's loyalty lit a fire that warmed an entire town. And if a crumbling warehouse can become a beacon, so too can our broken places become the ground where hope takes root. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with trumpets. They whisper through the laughter of a child, the loyalty of a dog, or the kindness of neighbors. And behind it all, there is the quiet hand of God, reminding us that what seems lost can be redeemed. May this story encourage you to see the hidden blessings in your own struggles, to trust that God's grace works even in silence, and to believe that love can rebuild what life has broken. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope. Comment your thoughts below, subscribe for more stories of courage and faith, and may the Lord's blessing and protection be upon you and your family today and always.